Student, after a long time, we are going to start our classes. I think students, you all are fine and you take care and be safe and stay at home. So, we are going to start our English 1 class. First of all, the chapter we are going to learn is chapter number 6, and the chapter name is Achilles. First of all, I'll read the lesson and you open your book, page number 82, and you see the lesson as I read the lesson. After completing the lesson reading, I'll start explaining of the lesson. Achilles, perhaps one of the most wild and fascinating characters I met during my travels, was the rose beetle man. He had a fairy tale air about him that was impossible to resist, and I used to look forward eagerly to my meetings with him. I first saw him on a lonely road leading to one of the remote mountain villages. I could hear him long before I could see him, for he was playing a rippling tune on a shepherd's pipe, breaking off now and then to sing a few words in a curious nasal voice. He had a fox-like face with large eyes. His dress was fantastic. On his head was a hat with a wide, floppy brim. His shirt was worn. Round his neck jangled a cravat of startling blue satin. The pockets of his coat bulged, the contents almost spilling out. His patched trousers drooped over a pair of leather shoes with upturned toes. This extraordinary character carried on his back bamboo cages full of pigeons and young chickens, and several mysterious sacks. With one hand he held his pipe to his mouth. In the other hand were held a number of lengths of cotton, to each of which was tied an almond-sized rose beetle, glittering golden green in the sun, all of them flying round his head, trying to escape from the thread tied firmly around their waist. Occasionally, tired of circling round and round without success, one of the beetles would settle for a moment on his head, before launching itself off once more on its endless merry-go-round. When he saw Roger, my pet dog, and me, the rose beetle man stopped, took off his ridiculous hat, and swept us a low bow. He smiled at us, put on his hat again, raised his hands, and waggled his long, bony fingers at me. I asked him if he had been to some fiesta. He nodded his head vigorously, raised his pipe, to his lips and played a lilting tune on it, and then stopped and jerked his thumb over his shoulder, pointing back the way he had come. He smiled and rubbed his forefinger and thumb together, expressing that he wanted money. I suddenly realized that he must be unable to speak. So, standing in the middle of the road, I carried on a conversation with him, and he replied with a clever pantomime. I asked what the rose petals were for. He held his hand out to denote small boys, took one of the lengths of cotton from which a beetle hung and whirled it rapidly round his head. Immediately the insect came to life and started on its planet like circling. Pointing up at the sky, he stretched his arms out and gave a deep nasal budging. Then he whirled his petals round his head so that they all started to budge quickly. Exhausted by his explanation, he sat down, played a short tune on his flute, breaking off to sing in his curious voice. They were not clear words, but a series of strange grunting. Presently he stuffed his flute into his pocket and then swung a small sack off his shoulder. He undid it, and to my astonishment, half a dozen tortoises tumbled out into the dusty road. Their shells had been polished with oil, and he had decorated their front legs with little red bows. Slowly the tortoise unpacked their heads and legs from their gleaming shells and set off down the road without enthusiasm. I watched them, fascinated. The one that particularly took my fancy was small, with a shell the size of a teacup. It seemed spritlier than the others. Its eyes were bright and its walk was alert. I sat looking at it for a long time. I convinced myself that the family would greet its arrival at the villa with enthusiasm. The fact that I had no money on me did not worry me. I would simply tell the man to call at the villa for payment. It never occurred to me that he might not trust me. The fact that I was English sufficient, for the islanders had a love and respect for the Englishman. I asked the rose beetle man the price of the little tortoise. He held up both hands, fingers spread out. I shook my head firmly and held up two fingers, unconsciously imitating him. He closed his eyes in horror at the thought and held up 9 fingers. I held up 3. The rose beetle man looked sorrowful and sighed. So we sat in silence and stared at the tortoise crawling uncertainly about the road. Then the rose beetle man picked up the reptile and showed me in pantomime how lovely its shell was. He handed me the tortoise and held up 5 fingers. I told him that I had no money on me and that he would have to come to the villa. He nodded as if it were the most natural thing in the world, excited by owning this pet. I wanted to get back home quickly to show it to everyone, so I hurried off along the road. Before diving down the hillside, I glanced back. The rose beetle man was still in the same place, warbling his flute. The new arrival was christened Achilles and turned out to be an intelligent beast with a sense of humor. He learned his name soon, and we had to call out once or twice, and he would appear lumbering along on tiptoe. He loved being fed and would squat regally in the sun while we held out bits of lettuce. He loved grapes as much as Roger did, so there was always great rivalry. Achilles would sit mumbling the grapes in his mouth, the juice running down his chin, and Roger would lie watching him, his mouth drooling saliva. Roger always had his fair share of the fruit, but even so he seemed to think it a waste to give delicacies to a tortoise. When the feeding was over, if I didn't keep an eye on him, Roger would creep up to Achilles and lick him vigorously to get the grape juice that the reptile had dribbled down on himself. Achilles would retreat into his shell with an indignant wheeze and refuse to come out until we had removed Roger from the scene. But the fruit that Achilles liked best was wild strawberries. He would become hysterical at the mere sight of them. The small strawberries he could devour at a gulp, for they were the size of a fat pea. But if you gave him a big one, he would grab the fruit and holding it firmly in his mouth, stumble off at top speed until he reached a quiet spot where he would eat at leisure. Achilles also developed a passion for human company. Let anyone come into the garden, and there would be a rustling among the bushes, and Achilles, wrinkled and earnest face, would poke through. If you were sitting in a chair, he contented himself with getting as close to your feet as possible, and there he would sink into a deep sleep. If you were lying on a rug sunbathing, he would surge down the path and onto the rug with an expression of bemused good humor on his face. He would survey you and then choose a portion of your body on which to practice mountaineering. If you shook him off, it would only give you temporary respite, for Achilles would circle the garden until he found you again. Then one day the garden gate was left open, and Achilles was nowhere to be found. Search parties were immediately organized, and the family wondered about the olive groves, shouting, Achilles, strawberries, Achilles. At length we found him. He had fallen into a well, the wall of which had long since disintegrated. He was, to our regret, quite dead. Even Leslie's attempts at artificial respiration and Margot's suggestion of forcing strawberries down his throat to give him, as she explained, something to live for, failed to get any response. His corpse was buried in the garden under a small strawberry plant. A short funeral address, read in a trembling voice by Larry, made the occasion memorable. It was only marred by Roger, who, in spite of all my protest, insisted on wagging his tail throughout the burial service. Not long after Achilles had been taken from us, I obtained another pet from the rose beetle man. This time it was a pigeon who was named Quasimodo, and thus began the next round of adventure in our family. So, student, I think you have heard the lesson and you have read the lesson at home. And the writer of this chapter, Achilles, was Gerald Malcolm Durrell. Gerald Malcolm Durrell was born in 1925 and he died in 1995. And he was born in Bihar, in India only. But but very soon they were shifted to England after his father's death in 1928. So when he was a baby, at the time only, he and his mother and other family members were shifted to England. And he was a renowned author, naturalist, zookeeper, conservationist, and television presenter. And the story we are going to study or we are going to read in this lesson is taken from the book My Family and Other Animals. And we know that Gerald Malcolm Durrell was a animal lover. Therefore, already we have got in his life sketch that he was a zookeeper also, and he therefore in this lesson we are going to read about the animals, how he gave interest upon the animals. First of all, we have to know that who was Achilles. Achilles was a brave and courageous Greek hero. Student, you have to know that who was Achilles. He was a very brave and courageous Greek hero. And according to Greek mythology, according to the belief of the Greeks, when Achilles was born, his mother held him by his heel. What did his mother do? His mother caught by his heel, and Achilles' mother dipped, means put him in the river Styx so that he could live forever. And his mother used to believe that if he will be dipped, if Achilles will be dipped in the river Styx, Achilles could live forever. Forever means there will be no death for Achilles. And the part that should not be washed in the river Styx was his heel. Only the heel part is left which could not be dipped in the holy water. And his heel was safe and it could not be dipped in the holy water. Therefore, if something may happen to him, if anybody would shoot to him, if anybody will shoot arrow to him, that the bullets of the gun or the arrow should have to pierce on his heel, and if anything struck on his heel, and the part which could bring his death is on his heel. So, students, let us begin the lesson. And I already told that who was Achilles, and he was a brave and courageous Greek hero, and his mother dipped him in the river Styx, and only the part of his body which could not be dipped in the river was his heel, and the part of his body which could bring his death was the heel, was his own heel. Perhaps one of the most wild and fascinating character I met during my travel was the rose beetle man. Here the writer has once met the most wild and fascinating characters, and that was the rose beetle man. And he had a fairy tale. He had a fairy tale here about him that was impossible to resist. And what happened, you see? And the writer used to look forward eagerly to my meetings with him. And here, according to the writer, the most fascinating character that he met during his travel was the rose beetle man. The writer first saw him on a lonely road, and that road was leading to a very interior mountain village. Remote is that very interior mountain village. The writer could hear him long before he could see him, because the writer might have not seen him, but he could hear him before he could able to meet him physically. But at first the writer heard him, but he has not met him physically. And the writer, how did the writer hear, student? The writer heard the rose beetle man, because the rose beetle man was playing a shepherd pipe, rippling tune, very soft and gentle tune that is played on a pipe, and breaking off now and then, and sometimes he could able to hear the sound, and sometimes he could not able to hear the sound. Means sometimes the sound is very high and sometimes the sound is low. And then to sing a few words in a curious nasal voice, and he could able to sing some of the words in his nasal voice, in his nose, because he might not be able to speak properly, and therefore, or he could not able to pronounce the word properly. Therefore, the writer could hear something in the nasal voice of the rose beetle man. Now, student, we have to know that how the rose beetle man look like. How the rose beetle man look like, we have to discuss. Now, his face structure we have to know. He had a fox-like face. Students, what kind of face he had? He had a fox-like face with large eyes. And his dress was little bit different, and therefore the writer has written that his dress was fantastic. On his head was a hat with a wide floppy brim. Now he was wearing a hat also on his head, and that has what? Floppy brim. And floppy brim means you have to know that at the edge around the bottom of a hat, the projecting edge around the bottom of a hat. And his shirt was worn, means the shirt which he was wearing was not good. The shirt was worn out, means that shirt has got the shirt might have become many years, and it might have in some part of his shirt it might have torn. And round his neck dangled a cravat of startling blue setting. And round his neck, what he was putting? He was dangling a cravat. And cravat is a short white strap, that is the fabric worn by men round the neck, and that is tucked inside an open necked shirt. And the pocket of his coat bulged, means and the pocket of his coat used to come out, the contents almost spilling out. And his patched trousers drooped over a pair of leather shoes with upturned toes. And his shoes are what? Upturned toes. Upturned toes means we have seen that the shoes are going. You can see the picture that how the upturned toes means up means